The morning mist clung to the Shenandoah Valley like a silk shroud, softening the jagged edges of the Blue Ridge Mountains. For Silas Thorne, this was the hour of peace, the fleeting moment before the world woke up and demanded something of him. Standing on the porch of the farmhouse his grandfather had built with timber hewn from the very forest that bordered their land, Silas took a deep breath. The air tasted of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint, sweet scent of ripening apples from the orchard. In 1860, life in Virginia moved at the pace of the seasons, dictated by the rising sun and the turning leaf. "Silas, the kettle's whistling." The voice belonged to Mary, his wife. It was a warm, grounded sound that pulled him back from the horizon. He stepped into the kitchen, where the stove radiated a comforting heat. Mary was busy at the wooden table, her sleeves rolled up, kneading dough with a rhythmic strength that spoke of years of quiet labor. "You're staring at the hills again," she said, not looking up, though a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Just checking the weather," Silas replied, resting a hand on her shoulder. "The harvest won't wait for a rainy spell." "It's not the rain you're looking for," Mary said softly, her hands pausing for a second. "It's the news from town. You're worried about the election." Silas didn't answer immediately. He sat at the heavy oak table, his fingers tracing the deep grooves in the wood. In the towns, in the newspapers, and in the heated debates at the general store, the air was thick with talk of secession, of rights, and of a growing divide between North and South that felt like a canyon widening beneath their feet. But here, on the farm, the only rights Silas cared about were the rights of a man to tend his soil and protect his kin. The rhythm of the land. The morning progressed with the familiar chores that had defined Silas's existence since he was a boy. He headed to the barn, the rhythmic thud-thud of his boots on the packed dirt, a metronome for his thoughts. His eldest son, Caleb, was already there, pitchforking hay for the horses. At 17, Caleb had his father's broad shoulders, but a restless energy that Silas found increasingly difficult to contain. "Pa, Mr. Henderson says they're forming a militia in the county seat. He says every man who can carry a rifle ought to be ready." Silas stopped, his grip tightening on the wooden handle of his bucket. "Mr. Henderson talks because he doesn't have a farm to run, Caleb. War isn't a parade, it's a butcher's shop. You stay focused on the livestock." "But if the North comes down here—" "If the North comes, we'll deal with it then," Silas interrupted, his voice like iron. "Until then, your duty is to this land. Do you understand?" Caleb looked away, the defiance still simmering in his gaze, but he nodded. A shadow over the valley. By midday, Silas rode his mare, Belle, down to the creek. This was his favorite part of the property, a place where the water ran clear over smooth stones, and the willow trees dipped their branches like thirsty travelers. It was the picture of American pastoral peace. Yet, as he sat there, he heard the distant sound of a steam whistle from the railroad miles away. To Silas, it sounded like a scream. The railroad brought progress, but it also brought the outside world, and the outside world was angry. He thought of his brother Elias, who lived in Pennsylvania. Their letters had grown cold over the last year. Elias wrote of the moral stain of the South, while Silas wrote of the arrogance of the North. Two men born of the same womb, raised in the same house, now speaking languages the other could no longer comprehend. The winds of change weren't just a metaphor, Silas could feel them in his bones. It was a pressure in the atmosphere, the way the animals went silent before a tornado strikes. The evening hearth. That night, the Thorne family gathered around the hearth. The firelight danced across the walls, casting long, flickering shadows. Mary mended socks, Caleb cleaned his boots, and the younger children played with carved wooden soldiers on the rug, a sight that made Silas's heart ache with a sudden, sharp pang of dread. He went to his desk and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. He tried to focus on the accounts, the price of grain, the cost of a new plow, but the words blurred. Instead, he took a fresh sheet of paper and began to write a letter to his brother. Dear Elias, the valley is beautiful tonight. The harvest looks to be the best we've had in years. I pray that common sense prevails in the halls of power, for I fear that if the storm breaks, none of us will find our way back to the shore. He stopped, the ink pooling on the tip of his quill. Outside, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, and a single dry leaf scratched against the glass like a fingernail. The transition from the farm to the town of Winchester was usually a journey Silas enjoyed. It was a chance to trade stories, feel the pulse of the county, and see faces other than those of his own kin. But today, as his wagon creaked along the dusty pike, the air felt different. It was heavy, not with the humidity of the valley, but with a palpable, electric tension. As he entered the town square, the usual sounds of commerce, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, were drowned out by a more aggressive noise. A crowd had gathered in front of the courthouse. Men in buckskin and fine wool stood side by side, their faces flushed, eyes fixed on a man standing atop a mounting block. "They want to tell us how to live," the speaker shouted, his voice cracking with fervor. "They want to dictate the laws of our land from 1,000 miles away. Will we stand for it?" A roar of no went up from the crowd. Silas pulled his team to a halt at the edge of the square, his heart sinking. These were his neighbors, men he had loaned tools to, men he had prayed with in church. Now they looked like a pack of wolves sensing blood. The gathering at the tavern. After finishing his business at the general store, where the clerk, usually talkative, barely met his eyes, Silas sought out a quiet corner at the local tavern. He hoped for a moment of normalcy, but the whispers of rebellion followed him through the door. Inside, the smoke was thick, and the conversation was centered on a singular topic: secession. "Silas, join us," called out Henry Miller, a prosperous landowner from the southern end of the valley. He gestured to a chair. "We're just discussing the governor's latest telegram. It's only a matter of time now." "Time for what, Henry?" Silas asked, sitting down heavily. "Time to burn down everything we've built?" The table went silent. Henry leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial hiss. "We're forming a local committee of safety. We need men like you, men who are respected. We're stockpiling powder and lead. If the North moves to coerce the states, we won't be caught sleeping." "You're talking about treason, Henry," Silas said quietly. "I'm talking about liberty," Henry countered, his eyes hardening. "There's a difference. You're either with your people, Silas, or you're against them. There's no middle ground left in Virginia." As Silas left the tavern, he was pulled into an alleyway by a hand on his sleeve. It was Thomas, an older man who worked as a printer's assistant. Thomas looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the street. "Silas, be careful," Thomas whispered. "They're watching who speaks against the cause. It's not just talk anymore. There are men, strangers, coming into town. They're looking for unionists. They call it a committee of safety, but it's becoming a mob." "I've lived here all my life, Thomas. They know me." "That doesn't matter anymore," Thomas said, shaking his head. "When the storm breaks, a man's character is the first thing to be forgotten. Go home, stay on your land, and for God's sake, keep Caleb away from the square." The return journey was a lonely one. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the fields. Silas felt like a stranger in his own county. The whispers of rebellion weren't just whispers anymore. It was a rising gale. When he reached his gate, he saw Mary waiting on the porch, a lantern in her hand. The small glow of the flame was a beacon of the life they had built, a life that was now under threat not from an invading army, but from the very hearts of their friends. He didn't tell her about the militia or the threats in the tavern. He simply walked up the steps, took the lantern from her hand, and blew it out. "It's going to be a long night, Mary," Silas replied, looking back toward the dark silhouette of the town. "Is it war?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Not yet," Silas replied, looking back toward the dark silhouette of the town. "But the peace is gone. I can't find it anywhere." The transition from peace to preparation happened with a terrifying speed. By the spring of 1861, the whispers had turned into the roar of cannons at Fort Sumter. The news traveled through the valley like a wildfire, consuming the last remnants of hesitation. For the Thorne family, the war was no longer a headline in a newspaper, it was a physical weight that settled in the center of their home. One Tuesday morning, a rider arrived at the farm. He wore a gray uniform that looked too new, the wool stiff and unweathered. He didn't come to trade or talk of the weather, he came with a ledger and a mandate. Silas Thorne, the state of Virginia calls for its sons. We're raising a company out of Winchester. Your name and your son's name are on my list. Silas stood on the porch, his hand gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. My son is a boy, and my farm is my priority. The farm won't matter. The air in Winchester was thicker than the humidity of the valley. It was a stifling, heavy weight that sat on the chests of the townspeople, a collective holding of breath. While the farm had been a sanctuary of silence, the town was a hive of hushed voices and darting eyes. Silas Thorne arrived on a Tuesday, his wagon laden with the last of the season's early apples. He had hoped the mundane task of trade would anchor him, but as he crossed the town limits, he noticed the subtle shifts in the landscape. Groups of men stood on street corners, not laughing or swapping tall tales as they once did, but leaning in close, their hats pulled low over their brows. The American flag still flew over the courthouse, but it felt like a relic of a fading era. The established order, the laws of the Union, and the long-standing peace of the Commonwealth was being eroded by a tide of resentment that Silas could no longer ignore. The general store's shadow. Inside Miller's general store, the bell chimed with a lonely, piercing sound. Silas walked to the counter, where Mr. Miller, a man who had known Silas since he was a boy, was staring blankly at a ledger. "Mornin', Henry," Silas said, placing a bag of coin on the wood. "I need salt, a new whetstone, and a keg of nails." Henry Miller looked up, his eyes red-shot. He didn't offer the usual handshake. "I can get you the salt and the stone, Silas. The nails are being held for the militia." "The militia?" Silas frowned. "We aren't at war, Henry. Since when does a farmer's roof take second place to a local guard?" "Since the world started turning upside down," Henry whispered, leaning over the counter. He glanced toward the door before continuing. "There's a meeting tonight at the old cider mill by the creek. You should be there, Silas. People respect you. They need to see that the old families are standing with us." "Standing with who? For what?" Silas asked, his voice rising. "Shh," Henry hissed. "Not here. Just come. If you care about the land your grandfather cleared, you'll be there." The secret gathering. The old cider mill was a skeleton of a building, long abandoned and reclaimed by ivy and damp rot. It sat in a hollow where the moonlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of oaks. As Silas approached on foot, leaving his horse tied a mile back, he felt a prickle of unease. He was a man of the light, of open fields and honest labor. This felt like the work of thieves. He slipped through the sagging doorway. Inside, the air smelled of fermented apples and wet stone. A dozen lanterns, shuttered to cast only the dimmest glow, revealed the faces of 30 men. These were the seeds of defiance. There was the blacksmith, the schoolteacher, the local magistrate, and several young men, including, to Silas's horror, his neighbors' sons. They were gathered around a makeshift table where a map of the county was spread out. "The federal government sees us as a resource, not a people," a man named Elias Vance was saying. He was a stranger to Silas, a man with sharp features and a voice like a whetted blade. "They will tax our land to pay for their factories in the North. They will tell us who we can be and how we must live, but the South is a different soul entirely." The seeds of defiance. The established order was being systematically dismantled in that room. Vance wasn't just talking about politics, he was talking about an identity. He spoke of the sacred soil and the tyranny of the iron rail. "We are not looking for a fight, but we must be ready to defend the threshold of our homes. We are forming a committee of safety. We will stockpile arms, we will train in the woods, and when the time comes to declare our independence from those who do not understand us, we will do so with one voice." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Silas felt a cold sweat on his neck. This was how rebellions began, not with a grand declaration, but with whispers in a dark room, fueled by a mixture of genuine grievance and manufactured fear. "What about the law?" Silas spoke up, his voice cracking the atmosphere. The room went silent. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward him. "The law is a contract, Silas," the magistrate, a man named Henderson, said calmly, "and when one side breaks the spirit of the contract, the other side is no longer bound by its letters. We are returning to the principles of '76. This isn't treason, it's a second revolution." Silas left the mill before the meeting concluded. He couldn't stomach the talk of cleansing the land and blood prices. As he walked back through the woods, the silence of the night felt different. The crickets sounded like the clicking of musket hammers. The rustle of the leaves felt like the movement of hidden armies. He realized that the established order wasn't just the government in Washington. It was the trust between neighbors, the shared identity of being one people, and the safety of his own home. All of it was being sacrificed at the altar of defiance. When he reached his wagon, he found a small mark carved into the wood of the seat, a simple S inside a circle. It was the mark of the committee. They hadn't asked him to join. They had already decided he was part of their world. He drove the wagon back toward the farm, the whispers of rebellion echoing in his ears. He looked at his hands on the reins, hands that had only ever known the plow and the Bible, and wondered how long it would be before they were forced to hold a rifle. The seeds had been sown, and in the dark, fertile soil of the Shenandoah Valley, they were already beginning to sprout into something sharp, cold, and deadly. The first encounter and the shattering of innocence. The morning of July 21st did not begin with the sound of trumpets. It began with the smell of scorched coffee and the wet, heavy humidity of a Virginia summer that seemed to stick to the skin like a second uniform. Silas Thorne sat on a fallen log, cleaning his spectacles with a piece of frayed linen. Across from him, Caleb was trying to keep his hands from shaking as he poured black powder into his horn. "Keep your eyes on the man in front of you," Silas said, his voice a low rasp. "Don't look at the horizon. Don't look at the flags. Just the man in front." The boy nodded, but his eyes were wide, reflecting the distant glint of the sun hitting thousands of bayonets. They were positioned on a ridge overlooking a creek, a place the locals called Bull Run. To the politicians back in Washington and Richmond, this was a chess move. To Silas, it was a slaughterhouse waiting for the doors to open. The wall of lead. The order to advance came at 10 in the morning. The regiment moved in a long rhythmic line, a wave of gray wool flowing through a field of waist-high wheat. It was beautiful for exactly 5 seconds. Then, the Union artillery opened fire. The first shell landed 50 yards to their left. It didn't just explode. It erased the world. Dirt, iron, and parts of men Silas had shared breakfast with flew into the air in a sickening geyser. The sound was so loud, it wasn't a noise anymore. It was a physical blow to the chest that stole the breath from his lungs. "Hold the line," the officer screamed. "Close up! Close up!" Silas stepped over the body of a man he didn't recognize. The wheat, once golden and swaying, was now being mown down by a horizontal rain of mini-balls. These weren't the round musket balls of his father's time. These were heavy, conical slugs of lead that whistled like angry spirits before they struck. When they hit bone, the sound was like a dry branch snapping in a winter forest. The loss of innocence. They reached a fence line and were ordered to kneel and fire. Silas bit the top of a paper cartridge, the bitter taste of saltpeter and carbon coating his tongue. He rammed the ball home, capped the nipple, and leveled the musket. Through the thick, acrid sulfur smoke, he saw a line of blue uniforms emerging from the woods across the field. He didn't see the enemy. He saw a young man, perhaps no older than Caleb, struggling with a jammed rifle. Silas pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised his shoulder, but he didn't feel it. He watched as the young man in blue spun around and fell, disappearing into the fields of crimson. In that heartbeat, Silas felt a piece of his soul wither. He had spent his life building a house, building a family, building a future. In 1 second, he had become a destroyer. He looked to his right. Caleb was staring at a man lying at his feet. The man was holding his own stomach, his face a mask of shock as the red stain spread across his shirt. Caleb wasn't firing. He was trembling, his musket lowered, his innocence dying in the mud. "Fire, Caleb!" Silas roared, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him violently. "If you don't fire, they will kill you. Fire!" Caleb looked at his father, and for a terrifying moment, Silas saw a stranger in his son's eyes. The boy raised his rifle and fired blindly into the smoke. He was no longer a son of the valley. He was a cog in the machine of death. The Crimson Tide. By midday, the heat was unbearable. The water in their canteens was gone, replaced with the metallic tang of blood in the air. The field was no longer recognizable. The wheat had been trampled into a red paste. The Union retreat was not a glorious victory. It was a chaotic, screaming scramble, but the Confederates were too exhausted to cheer. Silas slumped against a stone wall, his face blackened by powder, his hands stained a color that would never truly wash off. He looked at the fields of crimson. It was a graveyard without headstones. He realized then that the war wouldn't be over by Christmas. It wouldn't be won by grand speeches. It would be won by whoever could stand the sight of so much red the longest. "Pa," Caleb's voice was small like a child's. "I'm here, son." "I want to go home," Caleb whispered, looking at his blood-flecked sleeves. Silas looked at the smoke rising from the horizon, obscuring the sun. "There is no home to go back to, Caleb. Not after this. That world is gone."
Ink, blood, and the fragile thread of hope. By the winter of 1862, the war had ceased to be a series of battles and had become a state of being. The mail satchel was now the most sacred object in both the military camps and the valley farmhouses. For Silas Thorne, a letter was more than news. It was a tether to a version of himself that was slowly being erased by the grime of the trenches. The Soldier's Hand, written by candlelight. Silas sat in a makeshift lean-to near Fredericksburg. His fingers were stiff with cold, and his desk was the flat side of a wooden hardtack crate. The paper was yellowed and damp, but he gripped his pencil as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "My dearest Mary," he began, "the mud here has no bottom, and the cold has a way of finding the marrow in a man's bones. They say we are fighting for a cause, but most days we are just fighting for a dry pair of socks. Caleb is sleeping now. He is thinner than when we left, and there is a look in his eyes, a 1,000-yard stare that breaks my heart more than any Yankee shell. I saw him share his last bit of salt pork with a boy from Georgia today. There is still kindness here, Mary, but it is buried under layers of soot and sorrow." Silas paused, looking at his hands. They were calloused, scarred, and perpetually stained with the charcoal of the campfire. He wanted to tell her about the screams he heard at night, the phantom choruses of the wounded, but he didn't want to poison her mind with the horrors he couldn't forget. The Wife's Lament, written by the hearth. Back in the Shenandoah Valley, Mary sat at the kitchen table. The house felt cavernous and cold. The house-divided tension from Elias's visit still hung in the air like a foul mist. She dipped her quill into the last of the ink, her handwriting shaky but determined. "Silas, my heart," she wrote, "the orchard is bare this year. There were no men to pick the fruit, and the passing scouts took what little was left. I had to hide the cow in the deep woods last Tuesday when a Union patrol rode through. They took the fence rails for firewood. Our home is becoming a skeleton, Silas, but do not worry for me. My only fear is for you and our boy. Every time I see a rider coming up the lane, my breath catches in my throat, fearing he carries a telegram with a black border.
Please, tell Caleb his mother prays for him every hour. Tell him the dog still waits by the gate at sunset. The unspoken truths. The letters from the front line were often a dance of omissions. Silas didn't write about the time he had to scavenge boots from a dead man. Mary didn't write about the night the local committee of safety questioned her for hours about her unionist brother-in-law. The letters revealed the raw human cost through what was not said. Between the lines of "I am well" lay the exhaustion of a soul that had seen too much. In the ink-smudged "I love you" lay the desperate fear that this might be the last communication ever exchanged. The weight of the satchel. One afternoon, a courier arrived at the camp. He held a bundle of letters tied with a dirty string. As the names were called out, Silas watched the faces of his comrades. A man receiving a letter would weep with joy. A man whose name was skipped would turn away with a hollow expression. The silence of the mailbox felt like a death sentence. When Silas finally received Mary's letter, he didn't read it immediately. He took it to a quiet spot behind the supply wagons. He smelled the paper, searching for the scent of lavender or wood smoke, anything that smelled like home. "If I die here," Silas whispered to the empty air, "at least these words will remain. They're the only part of me the war cannot touch." A final note from Caleb. Tucked inside Silas's envelope was a scrap of paper from Caleb, addressed to his younger sister. "Dear Sarah, I don't like the sound of the drums anymore. Tell Mother I am being brave, but I miss the sound of the creek. Don't let them take my books. I want to read them again when the world stops shaking." Silas folded the scrap carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. The letter was a shield, heavier than any armor and twice as necessary.
The chessboard of bone and iron. The headquarters was not a grand palace, but a requisitioned farmhouse with peeling wallpaper and a draft that no fire could kill. General Robert E. Lee, the man the soldiers called Uncle Robert, sat hunched over a heavy oak table. Before him lay a map of Chancellorsville, its topography marked by the frantic red and blue ink of a war that refused to end. The architect of strategy was tired. His hair, once a dignified iron gray, was now the color of winter ash. To the public, he was an icon of stoic resolve, but here, in the silence of the midnight hour, he was a man weighing the lives of boys like Caleb Thorne against the survival of a cause. 1. The geometry of war. Strategy, as Lee saw it, was not about glory, it was about the brutal geometry of numbers. He was outnumbered 2-1. The Union's Army of the Potomac was a massive, well-fed machine under General Hooker, looming like a thunderhead across the river. Lee's mind was a whirlwind of variables: logistics, morale, terrain. He knew his men were starving. He had read the reports from the Winter of Despair. He knew Silas Thorne's regiment was down to half strength. To fight a defensive war was to die a slow death by attrition. To win, he had to do the unthinkable. He had to divide his smaller force in the face of a larger enemy. "It is a violation of every military maxim," he whispered to the shadows, but maxims do not win wars for the desperate. 2. The Council of Shadows. The door creaked open, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson entered. He was a man of cold piety and relentless aggression. In the architect's plan, Jackson was the hammer. They stood over the map, two men whose names would be etched in stone, debating the decisive move. The plan was a daring flank march, a 12-mile trek through the wilderness, a dense thicket of scrub oak and pine where the Union Army would never expect an attack.
"If we are caught mid-march, General, the army will be cut to pieces," Lee said, his voice level but his eyes searching Jackson's. "The Lord will provide a path through the wilderness, General," Jackson replied, his hand resting on the hilt of his saber. "But we must move with the speed of a mountain lion." The architect finalized the orders, and he thought of the men who would have to execute them. He thought of the feet that would bleed in those 12 miles of brush and the lungs that would burst from the pace. He was not just moving pins on a map, he was moving Silas and Caleb into the mouth of a furnace. The decisive move required absolute secrecy. One loose word, one captured courier, and the rebellion would end by sunrise. Lee felt the weight of the shadow of the spy, the very world Mary Thorne was currently navigating, knowing that his grand strategy rested on the silence of 100,000 hearts. By 3 a.m., the orders were signed. The ink was dark and final. Lee walked to the window and looked out at the campfires of his army. They looked like fallen stars scattered across the dark Virginia hills. He knew that by tomorrow evening, many of those stars would be extinguished. This was the architect's burden, to love his men like a father, yet to spend them like coin in a desperate gamble for independence. May God have mercy on us, for the world will not. 5. The pawn's perspective. The chapter ends by shifting back to Silas Thorne. He is woken up in the middle of the night by a frantic sergeant. There is no explanation, only the order. Pack your gear. No talking, no fires. We move at dawn. Silas looks at the map in his mind, the only map he knows, the distance between his feet and the home he left behind. He doesn't know the architect's plan. He only knows that the decisive move has begun, and once again, he is the one who must bleed to make it real. The cold current and the point of no return. The Rappahannock River was a swollen, churning vein of icy water that bled through the heart of Virginia. To the Union, it was a defensive moat. To the Confederacy, it was a liquid wall. For Silas and Caleb Thorne, it was the crossing of destiny, the physical threshold between the winter of despair and the uncertain promise of victory. 1. The Midnight Assembly. The orders arrived in whispers. No drums, no bugles. The men were shaken from their fitful sleep in the dead of night. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky as the regiment moved toward the riverbank. "Tie your cartridge boxes to your necks," Silas commanded, his voice a low hiss as he checked Caleb's gear. "If the water gets to the powder, we are as good as dead." The crossing of destiny was not to be made by bridge, those had long since been burned. It was to be made by pontoon and by wading. The engineers had been working in the dark, lashing wooden boats together to form a fragile ribbon of pine across the torrent. Midway across, the current seized them. The bridge swayed violently. One man, a boy from the valley no older than Caleb, lost his footing. There was a splash, a muffled cry, and then silence. The river didn't care about their decisive move. It only knew gravity and cold. "Don't look down," Silas whispered, his hand white-knuckled on Caleb's arm. "Look at the far shore. Keep your eyes on the trees." Just as the first ranks touched the muddy northern bank, the shadow of the spy proved its lethality. A single flare hissed into the sky from the Union-held heights. The secret was out. Crack! Boom! The Union artillery perched on Stafford Heights opened fire. The water around the bridge began to geyser. A shell struck the center of the pontoon line, sending splinters and men into the air. The crossing of destiny had become a gauntlet of fire. "Forward!" the officers screamed, their swords glinting in the light of the explosions. "Into the brush! Don't let them pin you to the bank!" Silas and Caleb scrambled up the muddy embankment, their clothes heavy with freezing river water. They were shivering, their teeth chattering so hard it was difficult to bite the cartridges. But as they reached the tree line, Silas looked back. Despite the fire, despite the freezing water, thousands of men were pouring across the river. The architect of strategy had gambled, and the pawn had delivered. By crossing this river, they had turned the Union's flank. They were no longer the hunted, they were the hunters. The tide of the war had shifted in the space of 300 yards of water. The Union commanders, who had felt secure behind their river moat, were now in a state of panic as the gray ghost of Lee's army appeared where it was never supposed to be. The cost of the shore. As the sun began to rise, casting a bloody orange light over the Rappahannock, Silas sat behind a cedar tree catching his breath. Caleb was beside him, his face masked in gray mud, staring back at the river. "We made it, Pa." "We made it across," Silas corrected, looking at the bodies floating near the bridge remnants. "The river took its toll. We've crossed into their world now, Caleb. There's no bridge left to take us back." The chapter ends with the regiment disappearing into the dense thickets of the wilderness. The crossing of destiny was complete, but the greatest battle of their lives, the thunder at dawn, was now only hours away. The iron gates and the triumph of the spirit. The transition from the heat of battle to the cold silence of captivity happened in a heartbeat. During the chaotic retreat following the crossing of destiny, Silas and Caleb were cut off from their regiment in the tangled brush of the wilderness. Surrounded by a wall of blue wool and leveled bayonets, the weight of the musket was finally lifted from their shoulders, only to be replaced by the crushing weight of the prisoner's chain. They were marched north, stuffed into cattle cars where the air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and fear. Their destination was a place that would become a scar on their souls, a sprawling, mud-choked enclosure known as a prisoner of war camp. As the heavy timber gates creaked shut behind them, Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The camp was a city of the damned. Thousands of men, or what was left of them, wandered a landscape of open latrines and tattered shebangs. There were no trees, no grass, only a sea of gray mud that seemed to swallow hope. "Don't look at the ground," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "Look at me. Keep your eyes on something living." Caleb didn't answer. He was staring at the dead line, a simple wooden railing 20 feet from the outer stockade. To touch it, or even to cross the shadow it cast, meant instant death from the guards on the pigeon roosts above. 2. The grueling reality. Life in the camp was a slow erosion. Rations consisted of a handful of moldy cornmeal and blue beef, meat so rancid it took on a sickly, iridescent hue. Scurvy began to claim the men who had survived the fields of crimson. Silas watched as strong men became skeletons, their teeth loosening in their gums, their spirits flickering out like dying candles. Every morning, the dead cart rolled through the camp. The sound of its wooden wheels on the hard-packed dirt was the heartbeat of the place. Silas and Caleb took turns staying awake at night, guarding their meager belongings, a tin cup, a frayed blanket, from the raiders, gangs of desperate prisoners who had turned into predators to survive. 3. The resilience of the human spirit. Yet, amidst the